Our last speaker of the morning before the panel discussion is going to be Mike Eisen, co-founder of the Public Library of Science, and he's going to give us the open science perspective. Are your slides?
Okay, great. Thank you. I encourage you to yell at me and interrupt me during my talk if there's questions that come up. I'm used to a more informal style here. So my charge to some extent here was to give a kind of open access, open science perspective on the OSTP policy and where I think it fits into things. So I'm going to do that. I'll start off by saying there's, for those of you who read what I write and stuff, you'll know I'm not a huge fan of the OSTP policy, but I will start by saying that there's a lot to like here. The policy, when it's fully implemented, will achieve a public good. It will greatly expand the number of papers that are freely available to the public. And it is the first real major policy that points to the importance of the reuse of the published content for data mining and other purposes. I think this has not gotten the biggest amount of attention from the people talking about it, but the idea that not only will these papers be freely available to read, but they'll be freely available for people to reuse is not just important in the grand sense. It's the whole reason I got into the whole open access push 15 years ago, when it was our inability to use any part of the scientific literature to do data mining and re-annotation of genomic data that got us first sort of just thinking about the issues of who controls content to the published literature and thinking about how we can get around it. So however, because I've been involved in this field for a long time now, sort of 15 years trying to push for open access, I like to look at what the OSTP policy does in kind of a historical context. And from my point of view, there's a major but to what's going on in the open access movement. And that major but is something we've talked about already, which is that there is, for me, a serious, needless, and I would actually say fatal flaw in the design of this policy and other policies, which is that this idea that we have a 12-month embargo period, or I should say a 12-month or longer embargo period, is just a completely unnecessary sellout of the public interest to the interest of publishers. And I'm going to talk about why I think that and as we move forward. But I first just want to give you a kind of a brief history of US government efforts to provide access to taxpayer-funded research. And this effort starts quite a while ago, actually. Many of you will remember this. Many of you won't even know it ever happened. But there was a proposal put forward by Harold Varmus, who at the time was the director of the National Institutes of Health, in 1999. The proposal was called eBiomed. And eBiomed had many features, which we can talk about, and I'll sort of come back to them at the end. But for the standpoint of access to published or NIH-funded research at the time, the most important feature was that it proposed a system that would have provided immediate free access to all the published papers, NIH-funded papers, and if the system had been implemented as described, basically to all papers in biomedicine and ultimately in all of science. Okay? So this is 1999. We start with the notion that what the government should be pushing is a policy that gets content out there freely and immediately. Now, those of you who were around back then know that eBiomed was not implemented. It actually, if you go back and look at the comments on it, it was reasonably popular with scientists and with members of the research community, but it was almost universally panned by publishers who wrote not only negative comments on when the policy was up for public comment, but they talked to members of Congress who made it clear that this system would never be funded by Congress. And so eBiomed was killed. And what came up in its stead was a system that was much less open and much less comprehensive, and that is the birth of PubMed Central. So PubMed Central was born as an alternative to eBiomed, and instead of having a system in which all published papers from biomedical community were immediately freely available and then reviewed and available in a common open archive, PubMed Central came in its stead, and PubMed Central had two sort of important features. It maintained the idea that there would be a free digital archive of the biomedical research literature that you could go to and search and use the papers in other ways. But when PubMed Central started off on the ground, it was voluntary. So it did not compel either publishers or authors to put their content into it. It's totally voluntary sort of service for the publishing community. And it allowed a delay of up to 6 months for journals who wanted to participate in PubMed Central. Okay, so 1999, we have immediate free access to the literature. 2001, we have 6-month delayed access to the literature. In 2008, the NIH, after years of pressure from Congress and other people, finally implemented a sort of mandatory public access policy for its grantees. And this policy, which I think most of you are probably familiar with, requires that if you get an NIH grant, the research papers that arrive from that grant have to be made accessible through PubMed Central, made accessible to the public through PubMed Central no later than 12 months after publication. Okay, so we've gone 0, 6, 12 months, right? That's 2008. And then along comes the policy in 2013 from the White House, right? And the White House policy moving in a good direction in one sense in that it's expanding the reach of the NIH public access policy to other federal agencies and sort of more generally to other areas of science. But it has now slipped even further on its requirement for the period of access that it would allow. It says it recommends 12 months, but it allows for those to go longer. So it doesn't take a statistician to realize that there's a pretty good trend going on here and that it's headed in the wrong direction if your interests are in getting public access to the content of government-funded research, right? And the question I think about a lot, and I think people here should think about and we should talk, is why? Why is it that we can take a van-sized robot, government money, take a van-sized robot, shoot it all the way to another planet, land it on the surface. I should say all this takes place in a shorter period of time than it typically takes for us to publish a scientific paper, right? We can shoot this rocket all the way to Mars, we can land it on the surface, and we can beam back these amazing pictures of the surface of another planet that you can just go online on the internet anytime, anywhere you are in the world. You can download these pictures. You can do whatever you want to with them because NASA rightly recognizes that it is a publicly funded endeavor and that it has a responsibility to make the stuff that it's doing available to the public. And it doesn't just do this in a casual kind of following the details way. It really puts a lot of effort into getting the public engaged with what it's doing and so forth. And there's a reason why NASA is a popular agency with people out there. My kids like NASA. They don't really give a crap about the NIH, right? And so, even though they are paying for their daddy's salary. So I want to talk about here this whole idea of embargoes and this crazy thing that's happened in this world where we've gone, from the dream of having no delay between when a scientist is ready to share their work with the world, that the public can access it, to this point of view where the most powerful person in the world, the President of the United States, has implemented a policy that says, it's important that people have access to this material, but it's not so important that we give it to them immediately. In fact, it's much more important that we sustain the publishing industry in the way we know it, that is a greater public good than the public good of giving people access to the most immediate scientific knowledge, okay? And I really want to discuss two things both now. I'm going to try to keep my talk short so we can have a longer panel discussion, although I'm not usually good at that. That there's two things. First of all, there's a fallacy, an intrinsic fallacy in the idea that we have to have these long embargoes. And the first one is the one that comes up more frequently, which is that publishers need to rely on subscriptions to fund their operations. You've already heard about it already today, and I'll just mention it again. This is just no longer true. There are not only theoretical, but perfectly viable extant business models that produce well-funded, sustainable publishers, profitable publishers that don't rely on subscriptions and therefore don't need any kind of embargo to collect the revenues. But I also want to mention the second part of this, which is sort of implicit to this whole discussion, which is the idea that we need publishers at all. And I say this as someone who's been directly involved in starting a publisher with lots of people. I don't mean this just about subscription-based publishers, but about publishers in general. We have created a universe in which publishers play this huge role in the scientific endeavor. And I want to at least you to consider that maybe we don't need them at all. Maybe this is just a historical relic. So I'm just going to mention where I stand on a couple of these issues and try to leave the brunt of this to the discussion. you saw a different version of this figure before, but you know, if you graph the rise of open access and don't put it necessarily on top of the rest of the world, you can see that open access is growing very, very rapidly. What was something that, you know, in 2000 or so, when this idea first started getting bandied about by us and people at Biomed Central and other places, the idea that you could sustain publishing by a service-based model instead of a subscription-based model, something that was laughed at routinely as the naive dreams of, you know, socialists from Berkeley, that this is like a thriving business, right? PLOS is now, you know, publishes the single biggest biomedical research journal in the world. Our growth rate is something that I'm sure most publishers would kill for in terms of the number of new papers we get every year compared to what we had before. And it's not just PLOS. There's Biomed Central, there's Hindawi, there's a whole bunch of publishers who are making successful businesses out of open access. There are now, you know, a large number of venture-funded open access journals that are popping up in California and across the world. This is now a major successful business. It's not, yes? That's number of publications from each of these journals, right? So it's still only about, you know, I think the number is something like 10% in 2013 of the literature is going to be in sort of frank open access journals. It's still a small portion of the literature, but it's growing rapidly, and the publishers that are using this model are successful financially. Okay, and those are the two crucial points. Okay. The model that most of them use is the one we've talked, you know, I think you've heard about a lot, which is this sort of service-based gold open access model where when you publish a paper in a journal, funds that are either coming from research grants or from the institution are used to cover the cost of publishing. It's the foundation for the business model that Biomed Central and PLOS started a decade ago, and it's now being used not only by sort of pure open access publishers, but by traditional publishers who either, as you heard from Elsevier, launched open access imprints or are playing around with open access as a mixed model for their publishing operations. So it's clearly a viable and attractive way to fund operations. In many ways, it's a better, more sustainable model for publishing because the costs involved in publishing, such as they are, largely they scale with the number of papers you publish, not so much with the number of people who read the papers. And so by attaching the revenues directly to the cost, you have a saner business model that doesn't have all the craziness involved in charging for subscriptions to content that is relatively inexpensive to disseminate, right? Subscription-based models made sense when you were shipping things around the world on paper and there was a cost involved in producing every printed copy. That's not true in the internet. The model itself is just not a sensible one for a electronic distribution. I'll also point out that there are other models emerging for how to fund open access journals, and I think the easiest to think about and the most direct, which is in many ways what eBiomed proposed back in the day, was just to have funding agencies fund the entire publishing process up front instead of going through the sort of elaborate gymnastics we have today where the NIH gives money to universities, the universities give money to libraries, the libraries give money to the publishers. If, you know, in the open access world, the NIH gives money to researchers, the researchers give money to publishers. At the end of the day, the money is all being transferred from the funding agencies to the publishers. It's a simpler way of doing it to just fund the publishers directly. And you know, you can argue about whether this makes sense and whether there's some inefficiencies and sort of biases that introduce into the process. But from a business standpoint, and certainly from a funder standpoint, it's the simplest way to do things. Directly subsidize them. It's less expensive, and it doesn't make everybody spend a lot of time on other stuff. So the fact that there's been a rise of open access publishing, I think it means that the government should look at the publishing landscape to say and say that there's just no reason to accept any delays in making works freely available. And you know, you've seen some of this kind of attitude coming out of the UK, although their policies were ultimately diluted. I think people are starting to recognize this, but to me it's incredibly disappointing that was not the foundation for a policy from the US government. And I'll talk more about that right at the end. Okay, but I also just want to mention another point, which is that, the world has changed dramatically, right? There's no doubt that publishers of scientific journals played an important role in science, right? And they have historically, they've been with us for 350 years and so forth. And today, they continue to provide valuable services to the community. That's not the case. But from my point of view, publishers collectively, especially subscription-based publishers, and in that bin I put a lot of commercial publishers as well as society publishers. They have been for the last decade, and in my opinion continue to be collectively a huge net negative for science. Okay? And I say that knowing that a lot of you are involved in this industry and that you won't agree with me. But they're a major obstacle to not just opening up the literature, but innovating. Oh, somehow my slide got cut off here. But innovating the ways in which we actually use the literature and we publish the literature. Right? The fact that we are still talking about doing simple things like putting data into papers, 20 years after the birth of the internet, is a sign of just how stagnant publishing is today. And it's stagnant because we have a system that has very, very few incentives to be innovative in the way that scientific papers are structured. It's a very tradition-laden industry. And I think as a rule, we would be better off, and we would have been better off if when the internet was born, all publishers just disappeared, and we as a scientific community were in the position to just reinvent the way that we communicated. We would have had a brief period of chaos, but things would have gotten better. And I just sort of want to emphasize that, just note how much changed when we shifted from the pre-internet publishing world to the post-internet publishing world. And how much changed in the fundamentals of what the industry should be doing compared to what actually changed in how the industry operates. So this is the world of pre-internet publishing, right? It was a difficult thing to do. To publish a journal was a labor-intensive, physically demanding, in many ways, enterprise, right? You had to, we moved away from movable type at some point before the dawn of the internet, but the process of printing a work was an expensive endeavor. And the process of shipping that around the world, whether it was on horses or trucks or airplanes, it was an expensive thing. When, as a community, we went to publishers and said, we want you to publish our material, the publishers were taking on not just a responsibility for managing the work, but there was an infrastructure that they had to manage, and it was a difficult one to accomplish. Okay, but in the internet publishing world, you go from a mechanical, physical world in which publishing was a difficult, time-consuming, expensive endeavor to a world in which publishing is a button, right? If you write something today and I want to share it with the world, I can post it on WordPress and press a button. And the mechanics of sharing that with the world are trivial and incredibly inexpensive. It's not that there's not other stuff going on, but the actual mechanics of publishing have shifted dramatically. They've shifted dramatically with nary an effect at all, however, on the way that we publish things. Right? I look at it this way. Francis Bacon, well, if you're English, you think Francis Bacon was the inventor of the scientific journal. If you're French, you think someone else did it. But anyway, the scientific journal was invented by Francis Bacon and his colleagues at the Royal Society in London in the 17th century. I think it's probably the most damning thing you can say about scientific publishing is that if Francis Bacon were to come back today and show up in this room and we showed him a scientific paper, he would be entirely comfortable looking at it. He would recognize it. It would look more or less like papers he was familiar with, maybe a slightly more compressed type font and color figures. But basically, the structure of how we communicate things has been largely unaffected by the biggest technological transformation that has happened in the intervening period of time between when Francis Bacon was around and we are today. And so I want to just give you my view of how this system could work and what I mean by the fact that we don't really need publishers and how they are, in fact, the whole system of publishing inhibits the way that we function. And I will say, many of the things I'm saying here today apply just as much to PLOS as they do to other publishers. PLOS is in some ways a traditional publisher. It uses a different business model, but it too is not broken free of the way that we have traditionally published in many parts of this. So the most important thing I think that we need to be thinking about is that papers should be published when authors feel they're ready to share them with the world, right? I mentioned it before, but the fact that it takes less time to send a robot to Mars and have it send back pictures to Earth, it takes less time to do that than it does for me to publish a paper from my lab and share it with the world, is lunacy, right? Or it's Marsasy. It's crazy. Why do we accept delays of 9 months or a year in some fields between the moment when somebody says they're willing to share their works with the world and the moment that they get out there? Okay, it's totally unnecessary. It's technologically unnecessary, and as I'll explain, I think it's functionally unnecessary for the way that the world should work. So this is very easy to imagine what you do. You have a place, and this was what eBiomed proposed back in 1999. There was a place where when you're ready to share your paper with the world, you post it there. I should point out, physicists have been doing this since 1994, and last time I checked, the physics community has not self-imploded and turned into some kind of massive jelly, which is what people seem to think would happen in biomedicine if this happened, right? There's a good precedent for this working in areas of science, and the fact that biomedicine is not doing it is a scandal, not something we should celebrate. Okay, so you have a place where you post the work. Whether it's something like arXiv or something like eBiomed or PubMed Central, it doesn't really matter. The simple principle is when you're ready to share your work, it goes into a place where people can find it, they can search for it, and they can use it. Now, I know what everybody's going to be saying, which is, peer review. We've got to have a system which we can recognize which papers are right, which papers are important, which papers are valuable for people to read. I'll say as an aside, I think the current system we have for doing that really does not do it well. That basically every paper that anybody wants to get published eventually gets published somewhere. That we do a pretty bad job of recognizing which papers are important. The current system we have for doing this is very, very ineffective. So but we do need a system for doing it. The question is whether we do all that work before a paper is published or whether we do it after a paper is published, right? After a paper is available. So the way I would like to see it happen is that you publish your paper, and many people will just be perfectly happy posting their stuff online and having people read it, and they don't really care about anything else. We're starting to do that with our work from our lab. It's a lot, 50% of the papers that publish in arXiv in the physics community don't ever go to a journal. They just publish in arXiv and people read them, and people are perfectly happy. Is that wrong? Okay, so that's what the arXiv people say, but it doesn't matter. There certainly are papers we posted papers on arXiv that we've never sent to journals, because they're just things we wanted to share, and it's not important to us that they get the imprimatur of a journal and so forth. But it is important to a lot of people, and it's important to not just the authors, but it's important to a lot of readers. So the way that should work is that you organize peer review after the paper's published. There's no particular reason why you have to get people to weigh in on how important a paper is or what's right and wrong with the paper without the public seeing the paper first. And I'm not going to go into the mechanical details of how I think this would work, but you can easily have a system in which peer review is organized by journals. It has all the features that you recognize today, except it's not used as a gate on whether a paper is published. Rather, it's used as a way to annotate the paper as to whether it's accurate, whether it's valuable, who's a likely audience, and so forth. And what's more, if you get rid of the idea that the most important thing we do in publishing is to publish paper, I see my red light's on, so I'm going to stop in 2 seconds. That anyone will be, you can encourage people to read and comment on articles in the same way, and so you can have the process of peer review be a lifelong dynamic process that goes along in the entire history of the paper. Okay. I think equally important to the issue of big data is that the actual reviews and so forth need to be public, and so people can use them and work on them in other ways. This can be done with minimal involvement of traditional publishers. It's basically a system for getting the scientific community and researchers to do this on their own. It's not entirely without need of people looking over it, but it does not need $9 billion a year in order to fund it. So what costs there are, I think which you could pay for in much the same way we've talked about in Gold Open Access Publishing, in which you either have some sort of service charges involved or you have just direct subsidies from the funding agencies. I'll end by just saying what I think the OSTP memo should have said, and maybe we can talk about this more, which is it would have been much simpler and much better for us if the government had said, look, you get taxpayer support for your research. When you do that, it just comes with a responsibility that you share the research with the people who funded it. That's the taxpayers. And therefore, it's going to be a requirement in your grants that if you get a grant, you have to make the papers that arise from that grant immediately freely available for access and reuse through something like a digital science library, something that looks like what eBiomed was going to be, but now for all of science. I'll save off on why I think Chorus is a terrible idea, but I'll point out my main point here, which is like, having fought with traditional publishers for 15 years to try to get things like things as weak-kneed as the OSTP policy as it exists today is the idea that after finally achieving this, we would turn over control of the system we create to the same people who not only have been fighting it, but I was just in Sacramento a couple weeks ago talking about a bill that's in front of the California legislature to push for a similar kind of policy in California. And right next to me was an Association of American Publishers lobbyist telling California why this shouldn't go forward. The publishers, while they've sort of signed on to the OSTP policy, they're still working to defeat it in other points. It's the logical equivalent to me of saying we're going to pass a gun check background bill and asking the NRA to be in charge of doing it. So, right. So I think that there's a lot of discussion we can have about how to implement this, but I think the simplest, least expensive, most useful, and forward-looking way of doing it for everybody is to just expand PubMed Central into something like a digital public library. And I'll just end for something I hope we can talk about in the panel session, which is this challenge. So forget about everything you know about the way scientific publishing works today, about the way science works today, and just ask yourself the question, if you were God and charged with the task of designing a communication system for science that would replace everything we do today, I really do challenge you to give me any good reason for why the system should be designed in a way that does not result in the publications, the data, and all the intellectual property arising from publicly funded research. Why that shouldn't just go into the public domain. We can do this. It's economically viable. It's good for everybody. You have to come up with a good reason for why we shouldn't do it that way. And if you can't come up with a good reason for why we shouldn't do that way, if you design things from scratch, then we shouldn't be doing things that way with the system we have today. We should be changing it to make things work the way that they should. Okay, thank you.
I'm sure we have questions for Mike.
I'm not sure there are going to be questions.
We're going to take one or two questions, and I'm going to ask the rest of the speakers from the morning to go ahead and start coming up, and we'll get our panel set up here while we're doing our questions so we can sort of maximize our time. Okay, Mike.
First of all, the archive is fantastic, but the serious papers in physics, more than 90% of them are published by publishers. Peer review is important. Second of all, I share your high opinion of NASA. The Curiosity story began in 1996 with the Mars meteorite that showed evidence of life on it. 2004, there was call for proposals. 2011, there was the launch. 2012, there was the beautiful landing. And none of us in this room have access to the data from the instruments because the scientists have to analyze it. And so the process of science takes a while. And finally, I am absolutely pleased that Francis Bacon would recognize the scientific process that we carry out today, because although the how has changed, the basic process of science is the same. But it was a beautiful talk.
I mean, I'll just say that the 50% number for archive comes from Paul Ginsburg, and you probably have different opinion about what constitutes a serious paper as opposed to something that someone's posting with. It's not really a work intended for publication. Right.
Paul created crackpot categories on the website.
Right. So one thing that's definitely true, and I would say that the biggest thing that holds us back from changing the way we publish is the fact that the way and this has nothing to do with publishers, has everything to do with the way scientists work, that we just let ourselves be dependent on journals as the primary way in which we evaluate people's work and we evaluate their science. The the fact that even in my own lab, I can't convince everybody to just post their stuff online. It's the fact that they still feel like that's the way you have to build your career. Is that there's a problem for the research community and universities and everybody to solve too, which is to change the way in which we evaluate people's work, to not lessen its value, not to lessen the important role that colleagues play in evaluating people's science and evaluating their important audience, but to not make that dependent upon publishing in particular journals as the way to do it. I think we can dissociate those two things from each other in a way that would benefit both the publishing process and the evaluation process. It's a longer discussion for how to do that, but I think that's the reason why people probably read a lot of those papers in archive, but they still feel compelled to send them off to journals. Not so much because that's where people are going to read them, but that's because it's important for their careers and so forth.
Just a quick question. I'm just interested, and this is a completely constructive question, by the way, about the very fluid system that you kind of talk about getting your results out there as soon as possible, kind of almost like the scientist blogger, I think you've called it in the past. I'm just interested in solutions that you might come up with that's very highly biased for the internet, which is in the English language. How does a researcher in like Colombia or China kind of become a scientist blogger when the effort that they would require to kind of do that in an understandable internet language, let's say, is probably just as big a deal to them as the effort required to publish a paper? I mean, and I ask that
as you probably know, this is a major issue, right? It's a major challenge for people who are not English speakers to communicate in a world that is dominated by English, right? I mean, their papers. I mean, in Latin America, it has a lot of journals that are in Spanish and Portuguese. So, but there's a big push there to have them written in English, and it's a challenge, right? But there's a reason why support for open access is extremely high in Latin America and China and other places, and it's because there's two sides to this coin, right? There's an access side and a publishing side. I think so. One thing I want to make clear is that we spend collectively across the scientific community, we spend on the order of $10 billion a year on publishing. I do not think that it is bad to spend $10 billion a year on science communication. That is, the process of communicating what we do in science to the public, to other scientists, to make sure that material is published in a great way. I'm excited about ways people are thinking about how to make papers more dynamic, to have data in them. That is not free. And anybody who thinks that publishing, that the process of communicating research results should not be invested in and should somehow the internet is going to magically make free, I think is missing the point. That the problem is we spend that money today in a very, very inefficient and ineffective way, in that what we get at the end of the day is not well-spent money for $10 billion, right? I think you could replace much of what the current publishing system does with a more efficient, faster system that would cost, when we try to ballpark it, I mean, I sort of like to think about this. If you gave me $10 billion a year and gave me the responsibility of publishing every paper, I would quickly become a very rich man, right? Because you could do it in a much more efficient, effective way, and you could keep most of the things that people actually value in the system for less money, including, and one thing I think would be great to do, would be to invest more effectively in tools to help individual authors communicate across whatever barriers they have in doing so, including language, technology, and other things. We don't invest in that. We invest in it almost not at all, simply because we're spending all this money in what I think is a bad way.